I was standing outside the Oval Office when the screaming started. It wasn't a protest, it was a massacre. Within seconds, the most secure building on Earth became a slaughterhouse. My earpiece went dead, and then I saw him, a fellow agent, his eyes milky white, lunging at the president's door. I didn't think. I just pulled the trigger. But more were coming. They weren't just fast. They were relentless. I grabbed my tactical gear and made a run for the bunker, stepping over bodies I recognized from breakfast. The world ended in the West Wing, and I'm the only one who made it out to tell the truth. Stay quiet. Stay sharp. This is just the beginning. The sound of the bullet-resistant glass in the West Wing spider webbing wasn't supposed to happen. It was a physics-defying crack, a high-pitched scream of reinforced silica giving way to something that shouldn't have been strong enough to dent it. I remember the smell of ozone and the heavy, expensive scent of floor wax that usually defined the halls of power, now replaced by the metallic tang of blood and something else. Something like wet earth and rot. My hand was already on the grip of my Sig Sauer P229 before the first shard hit the floor. Package is compromised, I barked into my comms, but all I got back was a wall of static and the sound of someone crying. Not a soft cry, but a ragged, wet sobbing that ended in a sickening crunch. I wasn't just a Secret Service agent. I was part of the elite Presidential Protective Division. We were trained for assassins, dirty bombs, and coups. We weren't trained for the First Lady trying to tear out the Chief of Staff's throat with her teeth in the middle of a private dinner. The lights flickered, that uniquely American hum of a high-end generator struggling to keep up. And in the strobing darkness, I saw them. Not the tactical threats I'd studied in Quantico, but men and women I'd worked with for years, their eyes clouded over like spoiled milk, their movements jerky and predatory. The silence of the White House, usually so heavy with the weight of history, was now filled with the wet slap of bare feet on marble. I didn't think. I just moved. The American dream I'd sworn to protect was dissolving into a nightmare of gnashing teeth and blue-blooded gore. I remember seeing a discarded Starbucks cup on the floor, the steam still rising from it, right next to a severed hand still twitching in its tailored suit sleeve. It's funny the things you notice when the world ends. You think about the mortgage you'll never pay off, the dog that's probably waiting at the door of your suburban spit level in Alexandria, and the fact that you never told your ex-wife you were sorry. I backed down the hallway toward the Situation Room, my boots slipping on the slick dark red floor. Every shadow was a monster. Every groan of the building felt like a death rattle. I saw Jenkins, a guy I'd played poker with every Tuesday for 5 years, pinned against a portrait of Teddy Roosevelt. Something was leaning into him, burying its face in his neck, and the sound it made, a rhythmic, guttural slurping, will stay with me until the day I die. I fired. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head, just like the range. But Jenkins didn't drop. He just turned the side of his neck a raw red crater and looked at me with a hunger that felt like a physical weight. That's when I realized the rules had changed. Washington, D.C. was no longer the capital of the free world. It was a buffet. I hit the manual override on the security doors, the heavy steel sliding shut with a finality that felt like a coffin lid. I was alone in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of presidents and the literal corpses of my friends, clutching a pistol with 12 rounds left and a radio that only whispered the screams of a dying city. I could hear them scratching at the other side of the door, a sound like dry leaves against a window, but with the force of a sledgehammer. They didn't want political change. They just wanted the heat under my skin. I checked my watch. 10:14 p.m. The world had ended 14 minutes ago. And I was still standing in the most famous house on earth, wondering if I should save the last bullet for myself or use it to see what was waiting for me in the tunnels below. I thought about the 4th of July fireworks over the National Mall, the smell of charcoal and cheap beer, the sense of security we all took for granted. It was gone. All of it. The grid was failing. The sky outside was probably glowing orange with the fires of 1,000 burning cars. And here I was, the last line of defense for a country that didn't exist anymore. I turned toward the service stairs, the ones that led down to the PEOC and the deeper, darker secrets of the hill. If I was going to die, it wasn't going to be while cowering behind a desk. I checked my spare mags, wiped the sweat and someone else's blood from my eyes, and stepped into the dark. Every creak of my leather holster sounded like a thunderclap. Every breath felt like it was being stolen. I reached the basement level, where the air was colder, smelling of damp concrete and old paper. The emergency lights were red here, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like demons on the walls. I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping from behind the heavy oak door of the archives. I hesitated. My training said, move on, but my gut said someone was still alive. I pushed the door open, my weapon light cutting through the gloom. It wasn't a survivor. It was the president's youngest daughter, huddled under a table. But she wasn't hiding. She was chewing on the leg of a mahogany chair, her jaw unhinged, her eyes reflecting the light like a cat's. She didn't scream. She hissed. It was a sound that didn't belong in a human throat. I had held the door for this girl. I had carried her bags. I had watched her grow up in the public eye. And now I had to decide if I was still an agent or just a man trying to see tomorrow. I didn't fire. I couldn't. I backed out, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and ran. I ran past the kitchens, where the smell of burnt pot roast mingled with the scent of death. I ran past the press briefing room, where the microphones stood like tombstones, waiting for an announcement that would never come. By the time I reached the tunnel entrance, I was gasping, the air hot and thick in my lungs. I looked back one last time at the hallway, the portraits of the men who built this nation watching me in silent judgment. I plunged into the darkness of the subterranean DC. Transit system, a labyrinth of secrets and shadows, knowing that the real fight was only beginning. The city above was a pyre, and the world below was a grave. But as long as my heart was beating, as long as I had lead in the chamber, I was going to find a way out of this hell. I had to. Because if the White House had fallen, then nowhere was safe, and the story of how it all ended needed someone left to tell it. I moved through the tunnels, the damp walls pressing in on me, the sound of my own footsteps echoing like a countdown. I found a tactical vest in a security locker near the bunker entrance. The weight of the ceramic plates, a small comfort against the madness. I swapped my suit jacket for the black nylon, feeling the transition from protector to predator. I wasn't guarding a man anymore. I was guarding the last flickering ember of my own life. I heard the scratching again, but this time it was coming from the pipes above. They were everywhere. They were in the walls, in the vents, in the very foundation of the city. I realized then that the outbreak wasn't just a disaster. It was an extinction event, and I was just a speck of dust trying not to get swept away. I reached the service exit that led out near the Treasury building. I cracked the door, just an inch, and the heat hit me like a physical blow. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of distant sirens that no one was answering. The streets were a graveyard of stalled SUVs and shattered glass. A lone American flag fluttered from a bent pole, scorched and tattered, dancing in the updraft of a nearby fire. I stepped out into the humid DC night, my eyes scanning the rooftops, my finger itchy on the trigger. This was my city. This was my country. And I was going to take it back, one bullet at a time, or I was going to die trying in the dirt of the land I loved. The asphalt was still radiating the day's heat, a shimmering haze that distorted the skeletal remains of the city. I stayed low, hugging the granite base of the Treasury building, my breathing shallow and controlled. The transition from the claustrophobic, vent-crawling nightmare of the White House to the open graveyard of 15th Street was jarring. Out here, the scale of the collapse was absolute. I looked back once at the executive mansion. Smoke was billowing from the west wing, a thick, greasy plume that choked the stars. That was the seat of power, the most guarded house on the planet, and it was currently a buffet for the walking dead. I turned my gaze back to the street. To my left, a motorcade of black Suburbans was snarled in a chaotic knot, the lead vehicle nose-deep in the side of a DC Metro bus. The windows were shattered, and the interior of the SUV was slick with something dark that didn't look like oil. I didn't see any bodies, which was worse. It meant they were up. It meant they were hunting. I checked my Sig Sauer P229. I had 3 magazines left on my belt and 1 in the well. 49 rounds of .357 Sig. In a city of hundreds of thousands of monsters, 49 rounds felt like throwing pebbles at a hurricane. I moved with a predatory stillness, a ghost in a charcoal suit that was now shredded and stained with the copper scent of blood. Some mine, mostly not. Every muscle ached with the kind of deep thrumming fatigue that caffeine couldn't touch. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, was running on a jagged, broken cycle in my brain. My training told me to find a high ground observation post, but the scratching I'd heard in the pipes back in the basement suggested that being inside a building was just a different kind of trap. I stepped over a discarded high-heel shoe and a pile of press credentials that had been trampled into the dirt. The silence of the city was the most terrifying thing. Washington, D.C. is never quiet. It's a city of sirens, protests, and the constant hum of power. Now, the only sound was the distant rhythmic thud of an abandoned helicopter's blade clipping a skyscraper somewhere toward K Street, and the wet, rhythmic slapping of feet on pavement. I froze. The sound was coming from behind the stalled bus. I pressed my back against the cold stone of the Treasury, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. A figure drifted into view from the shadows of the bus. It was wearing a park police uniform. The Stetson was gone, and half of its face had been sloughed off, revealing the white of the jawbone and the wet gleam of muscle beneath. It didn't walk so much as it lurched, its center of gravity shifted by the missing chunk of its torso. It stopped, its head tilting with a sickening, mechanical jerk. It sniffed the air. The scent of my sweat, the salt, and the fear must have been like a flare in the dark. I raised the Sig, the front sight post settling on the creature's forehead, but I hesitated. The crack of a gunshot would be a dinner bell. I looked around, desperate for a silent option. A few feet away, a tactical breaching tool, a Halligan bar, lay abandoned next to a smashed police cruiser. I lowered the firearm, holstered it with a practiced motion, and lunged for the iron bar. The creature hissed, a sound like steam escaping a radiator, and lunged. It was faster than the ones I'd seen in the hallways of the East Wing. It moved with a frantic, twitching energy. I swung the Halligan bar in a wide, desperate arc. The heavy iron caught the thing in the side of the head with a dull thunk, the kind of sound a bat makes hitting a wet rug. The zombie spun, its neck snapping with a sound like dry kindling, but it didn't go down. It clawed at my suit jacket, its blackened fingernails ripping through the fabric. I could smell it now, the cloying, sweet stench of advanced decomposition mixed with the metallic tang of fresh gore. I stepped into its guard, slamming the fork end of the bar into its throat and driving it backward. We hit the side of the bus with a metallic boom that sounded like a gong in the stillness of the night. I didn't give it a chance to recover. I brought the blunt end of the tool down on the crown of its skull once, twice, 3 times, until the resistance stopped and the thing slumped into a heap of blue polyester and ruined flesh. I stood over it, gasping for air, my hands shaking. I was a Secret Service agent. I had been trained to take a bullet for the leader of the free world. I had been trained in advanced ballistics, evasive driving, and international protocol. None of it had prepared me for caving in the skull of a park ranger with a piece of scrap metal in the shadow of the treasury. I wiped a spray of dark ichor from my cheek and looked at my hands. They were stained. Everything was stained. I realized then that the man who had walked into the White House this morning for his shift was dead. Only the survivor remained. I scavenged the cruiser. The radio was spitting out nothing but a flat, agonizing hiss of white noise. I found a half-empty bottle of lukewarm water in the cup holder and downed it in 3 long, painful gulps. It tasted like plastic in salvation. I also found a heavy-duty flashlight and a spare box of shotgun shells, though I had no shotgun. I tucked the shells into my pocket anyway. Currency or a future weapon? I didn't know which. As I moved away from the cruiser, I looked toward the National Mall. The Washington Monument stood like a giant, pale finger pointing toward a god that had clearly abandoned us. Fires were burning at its base, lighting up the sky in a hellish orange glow. I could see shapes moving in the flickering light, thousands of them. The mall, the great gathering place of the American people, was now a feeding ground. I headed north, toward the McPherson Square area. My goal was a Secret Service safe house disguised as a nondescript law firm on 14th Street. If anyone was left, if there was a radio that still worked, if there were any supplies, that's where they'd be. But every block was a gauntlet. I moved through an alleyway, the walls tight around me. Above, I heard the scratching again. I looked up and saw a pale, bloated face peering down from a fire escape 3 stories up. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting. It dropped. It didn't scream. It just fell like a sack of stones. I dived out of the way, the creature slamming into the pavement where I'd stood a second before. Its legs snapped on impact, the bone protruding through the skin, but it didn't care. It began to crawl toward me, its arms pulling its broken body with terrifying strength. I didn't waste a bullet. I stepped over it and ran. The psychological toll was beginning to set in. The sensory overload they warn you about in survival training. My brain was trying to process the impossibility of what I was seeing, while simultaneously focusing on the minute details of survival. I passed a storefront window for a high-end boutique. Inside, a woman in a Chanel suit was pressed against the glass, her fingers smeared with blood as she tried to claw her way out. But she wasn't trapped by the door. She was trapped by the things behind her. As I watched, she was pulled back into the darkness of the store, her silent scream lost behind the reinforced glass. I wanted to help. The urge to protect and serve was a phantom limb, itching with a need I couldn't satisfy. But I knew that if I broke that glass, I'd be dead in seconds. I had to be cold. I had to be a machine. I reached the corner of 14th and I Street. The safe house was just half a block away, but the intersection was a nightmare. A tanker truck had overturned and caught fire, creating a wall of flame that bisected the street. The heat was blistering, peeling the paint off the nearby buildings. In the red light of the fire, I saw them, a horde, not a dozen, not 100, but a sea of them, pushed toward the intersection by some unseen tide. They were charred, their clothes burnt away, their skin bubbling and blackened, yet they moved with a singular, mindless purpose. They were drawn to the heat and the light. I ducked into the recessed doorway of a bank, pressing myself into the shadows. I watched as the mass of undead shuffled past, a slow-motion river of rot. One of them stopped. It was a child, or it had been. It was wearing a DC United jersey, the red fabric now a dull, muddy brown. It turned its head toward the bank doorway. I held my breath, my hand on the grip of my P229. I thought about my own son, safe, I hoped. With my ex-wife in Virginia, I hadn't heard from them since the first reports came in. The thought was a jagged shard in my gut. The creature took a step toward me, its milky eyes searching the dark. I closed my eyes and prayed for the first time in 10 years. Don't make me do it. Don't make me kill a child. The creature paused, a low growl vibrating in its chest, and then a car alarm triggered a block away. The sound was like a dinner bell. The child things spun around and joined the rest of the horde as they surged toward the new noise. I waited until the sound of their footsteps faded into the crackle of the fire. I moved toward the safe house, my legs feeling like lead. The entrance was a simple steel door in a brick facade. I punched the code into the keypad, my fingers trembling. The red light blinked. Dead. No power. I cursed under my breath and pulled a set of lockpicks from my kit, standard issue for an agent on the advance team. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the tension wrench twice. Focus, I whispered, the sound of my own voice strange and raspy. Focus, agent. Tactical breath. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. I calmed my heart rate, felt the tumblers click, and the door groaned open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and gun oil. The emergency lights were on, casting a dim, flickering red glow over the Tactical Operations Center. It was empty. The monitors were mostly static, but one showed a grainy feed from a drone over the Pentagon. The building was partially collapsed, and the parking lot was a mass of movement that made my skin crawl. On the central table lay a radio, a heavy-duty Motorola. It was chirping, a high-pitched, rhythmic signal. I grabbed it. This is Special Agent Miller, badged 4492. Does anyone copy? Is there anyone on this net? Static, and then a voice. Thin and distorted. Lifa, this is Site R. We are at Condition Black. All assets neutralized. If you are hearing this, the president is confirmed. The signal cut out. Confirmed what? Dead? Evacuated? Turned? I slumped into a chair, the weight of the world finally crashing down on me. I was in a room full of weapons, body armor, and rations, and I had never felt more helpless. I looked at the wall map of DC. It was covered in red pins marking hot zones. The whole map was red. I spent the next hour rearming. I swapped my ruined suit jacket for a tactical vest. I found a Remington 870 shotgun and slung it over my shoulder, then loaded my pockets with fresh mags for the SIG. I found a backpack and stuffed it with MREs and a first aid kit. As I worked, the silence of the safe house began to feel heavy. The scratching started again, not from the pipes this time, but from the other side of the door I just entered. They had followed me. They were patient. They were persistent. I looked at the back exit, a reinforced door that led to an underground parking garage where a hardened Suburban was supposedly waiting. I checked the monitors one last time. A movement on the 14th Street camera caught my eye. A figure was standing in the middle of the street, completely still, unbothered by the zombies shuffling past. It was wearing a dark suit, perfectly pressed, and a pair of sunglasses despite the night. It looked up directly at the camera and smiled. It wasn't one of the monsters, at least, not the mindless kind. It raised a hand and pointed a finger directly at the building I was in. Then, the camera feed cut to black. A cold chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning washed over me. This wasn't just a biological fluke. This was orchestrated. I grabbed my gear and headed for the garage. My mission had changed. It was no longer about protecting a man or a building. It was about finding out who had murdered my country and making them pay for it. I reached the Suburban, the keys already in the ignition as per protocol. I turned the engine over, the V8 roaring to life, a beautiful, violent sound in the tomb of the city. I slammed the vehicle into gear and punched the remote for the garage door. As the heavy steel shutter began to rise, I saw dozens of glowing eyes in the darkness of the alley. They were waiting for me. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "Get off my lawn," I growled and floored the accelerator. The heavy SUV bucked as it hit the first line of the undead, the reinforced brush guard liquefying bone and sinew. I burst out of the garage and into the street, the tires spinning on a slick of gore. I didn't look back. The city was burning, the world was ending, but I had a full tank of gas, a cabin full of lead, and a rage that was just beginning to catch fire. I was a speck of dust, maybe, but I was a speck of dust with a mission. And in the new world, that made me the most dangerous thing on two legs. I steered toward the bridge, toward the hills of Virginia, toward the unknown, leaving the hollowed-out heart of the American Empire to the ghosts and the monsters. The fight for D.C. was over. The war for humanity was just beginning. I could feel the psychological weight shifting. The grief was hardening into a cold, sharp edge. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was hunting. And as I crossed the Potomac, the black water reflecting the orange sky, I knew I would return. I would return with an army, or I would return as the last man standing, but I would return. The flag I'd seen earlier, tattered and scorched, still danced in my mind's eye. It wasn't a funeral shroud. It was a banner. I reached for the radio again, switching to the emergency broadcast frequency. "This is Agent Miller," I said, my voice steady now, hard as the granite of the Treasury. "I'm coming for you, all of you." The only response was the low, guttural moan of the city behind me. But for the first time since the lights went out, I wasn't afraid. I was the storm. The Potomac wasn't a river anymore. It was a moat, a dark, churning ribbon of sludge that separated the dead heart of the empire from the dying limbs of the suburbs. As I drove the commandeered black Suburban across the Key Bridge, the tires crunched over a carpet of shattered glass and spent brass, a sound like grinding bone that echoed off the silent skeletons of stalled commuters. The dashboard lights were the only warmth in the world. A faint green glow illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cabin. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the silhouette of the Lincoln Memorial recede into the haze of smoke and moonlight. It looked like a tombstone now, a giant marble marker for a dream that had choked on its own blood. My hands were locked on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the leather slick with a mixture of sweat and a dark copper-scented grime I didn't want to identify. My tactical vest felt like a lead weight against my chest, but the familiar pressure of the Sig Sauer P320 against my hip was the only thing keeping me grounded. I was Agent Miller. I was the man who stood in front of the leader of the free world. I was the man who had watched that leader get torn apart by things that didn't care about term limits or the Constitution. The radio hissed, a sea of white noise that occasionally coalesced into the ghost of a human voice. I'd set it to the emergency bands, hoping for a coordinate, a rally point, a sign that the Secret Service's continuity of government protocols weren't just ink on a page in a burning basement. For 20 minutes, I drove through Arlington in a trance, weaving through a labyrinth of stalled vehicles. The sights were a strobe light of horror, a child's car seat smeared with red, a military Humvee flipped onto its roof, with the gunner still strapped into the turret, his torso a hollowed-out shell. Then the radio sparked to life. It wasn't the low moan of the city. It was a rhythmic clicking, a code. Triple tap, pause, double tap. The anvil signal. My heart hammered against my ribs. That was the internal comm signal for a secure fallback. Anvil, this is Aegis 7, I whispered into the handset using my old call sign. I am mobile on Route 50, heading west-northwest. Do you copy? Aegis 7, this is High Tower, the voice came through, cracked and shivering with static, but unmistakably human. We are holding the line at the Mount Weather transition point near the Dulles Corridor. We have a secure perimeter. Identify yourself with the Protocol Delta code. Whiskey Tango Niner 4 Echo, I barked, my voice cracking with a sudden desperate hope. Copy 7. Come home. We have the director. We have a plan. The storm is breaking. The director, Director Sterling. He was a hard-nosed bastard who had been with the service since the Reagan years. If he was alive, there was a chance. I pushed the Suburban harder, the engine roaring as I cleared the bottleneck of the Arlington Cemetery. I didn't look at the graves. The irony of thousands of dead soldiers watching me pass while the new dead prowled the streets was too much for my fraying sanity. I reached the Dulles Access Road, a stretch of highway that should have been a graveyard of commuters but was strangely clear. It had been swept, purged. I saw the signs of a professional military cleanup, piles of charred remains pushed into the ditches, the smell of diesel and bleach hanging heavy in the air. I reached the nest at 0200 hours. It was a converted logistics hub, a windowless concrete monolith surrounded by 3 layers of concertina wire and concrete HESCO barriers. M1 Abrams tanks sat idling at the gates, their engines a low guttural growl that felt like a heartbeat. Men in full tactical gear, wearing the familiar star-shaped badges of the service over their fatigues, moved with a precision that made my throat tighten. I was scanned, vetted, and ushered inside through a series of decontamination airlocks that smelled of industrial-grade lye. Inside, the atmosphere was a jarring contrast to the chaos outside. It was quiet, clinical. Screens lined the walls of the command center, showing grainy feeds from across the country. I saw Philadelphia in flames. I saw the Chicago skyline dark. And then I saw the director. He was standing over a digital map, his face etched with lines that looked like canyons under the harsh fluorescent lights. Beside him stood Agent Hayes, my former mentor, a man who had taught me everything I knew about the kill zone and the line of fire. "Miller," the director said, not looking up, "I heard you made it out of the West Wing. I expected nothing less." "Sir," I said, snapping a reflex salute that felt like it belonged to a different life. "What's the status? Are we regrouping? Is there a counteroffensive?" Hayes stepped forward, his eyes cold, devoid of the warmth I remembered. He didn't offer a hand. He just looked at my gear, my blood-stained shirt, my shaking hands. "The counteroffensive is already underway, Miller, but it's not what you think. We aren't reclaiming the streets. We're securing the future." He led me to a side room, a glass-walled observation deck overlooking a lower level of the facility. I looked down, and my stomach did a slow, sickening roll. There were hundreds of people down there, sitting on cots. But they weren't the elite. They weren't the scientists or the leaders. They were teenagers mostly, strong, healthy-looking men and women. And they were being sorted. I saw a doctor in a hazmat suit, checking their teeth, their eyes, their muscle tone. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "The Preservation Project," the director said, joining us. "The world as we knew it is gone, Miller. The infection is airborne in high-density areas, mutating faster than we can track. The hollows out there? They aren't just zombies. They're a biological reset. We've realized that we can't save everyone. So, we're saving the best, the genetically viable, the ones who can rebuild the species. And the rest?" I asked, my hand drifting toward my holster. Hayes placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a warning. "The rest are a drain on resources. We've had to make hard choices, Miller. Decisions that would break a lesser man. We've secured enough supplies for 500 people for 20 years. Anyone not on the list is redirected." "Redirected where, Hayes?" "To the perimeter," Hayes said flatly. "They serve as a buffer, noise, distraction for the swarms. We use them to keep the dead away from the nest." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a betrayal of a person. It was a betrayal of the oath. The protect and defend wasn't supposed to have a footnote about genetic viability. These men, my brothers, were using American citizens as live bait. The storm I'd felt myself becoming wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was a cold, raging reality inside my chest. "You're murdering them?" I said, the words tasting like ash. "We're surviving," the director snapped. "Now, Agent Miller, you're a Tier 1 asset. You're on the list. We need you to lead the scavenge teams. We need you to go back into the city and retrieve the last of the experimental serums from the CDC transit hub. You know the tunnels. You know the layout. You do this, and your place in the new world is guaranteed." I looked at Hayes. I looked for a flicker of the man who had bought me my first beer after my graduation from the academy. I found nothing but a hollow shell, a man who had traded his soul for a seat in a concrete bunker. "I need a minute," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I need to check my gear." "Take 5, Hayes said, his grip loosening. "Then we brief." I walked away, my mind spinning 1,000 miles an hour. I wasn't going to the CDC. I wasn't going to help them build a kingdom on a mountain of corpses. I moved through the facility, my service credentials still granting me access to the secure zones. I found the communications hub, a small room tucked away near the secondary generators. There was a young tech there, a girl no older than 20, her eyes red from crying. She looked at my badge and stood up. "Sir, I'm not supposed to be in here," she stammered. "Internal affairs, kid," I lied, the words coming out smooth and sharp. "I need the master override for the perimeter gates. We've got a breach report on the west wall." She didn't question me. In the middle of an apocalypse, a man in a suit with a badge is still a god. She typed in the sequence, and I watched the screen. The gates, the massive reinforced steel barriers that kept the redirection zones separated from the nest, were now under my control. "Get out of here," I told her. "Go to the lower levels. Don't come up until you hear the sirens stop." She ran, and I was alone. I looked at the monitors. Outside the walls, thousands of people were huddled in the buffer zones, crying, screaming, unaware that they were nothing more than a biological fence. Beyond them, the darkness was moving. The swarms were coming, drawn by the lights and the hum of the generators. I could see them on the thermal cams, thousands of heat signatures, a rolling wave of hunger. I reached for the PA system. I didn't announce myself. I didn't give a speech. I just opened the gates. The sound of the hydraulic locks disengaging was like a thunderclap that shook the facility. On the monitors, I saw the massive steel doors swing wide. The people in the buffer zones froze for a second. Then they began to run, not away, but in. They flooded into the courtyards, a desperate, terrified mass of humanity seeking the safety they'd been promised. And right behind them, like a shadow following the light, came the hollows. The sirens began to wail, a high-pitched scream that tore through the concrete. I heard the shouting in the hallways, the heavy thud of boots, the bark of orders. I stepped out of the comms room and found Hayes standing there. He had his weapon drawn. "What did you do, Miller?" he roared, his face purple with rage. "You just killed us all." "No," I said, drawing my SIG in one fluid motion. "I just ended the preservation. We all go together, Hayes. That's the deal. Nobody gets a free pass while the world burns." I felt the heat of the round whistle past my ear as I dove behind a stack of crates. I returned fire. 2 rounds to the center mass, just like we'd practiced on the range 1,000 times. Hayes slumped against the wall, his eyes wide, his hand clutching a chest that was quickly turning red. I didn't feel a thing. No grief, no regret. Just a cold, sharp edge. I ran toward the main atrium. The facility was falling apart. The redirected people were clashing with the guards, a chaotic melee of fists and rifle butts. And then the first of the hollows broke through the inner perimeter. They didn't run. They moved with a frantic, jerky speed, their limbs snapping and popping as they threw themselves at anything that breathed. They were screamers, the kind that had been mutated by the concentrated viral load in the city. Their cries were a pitch-black vibrato that shattered glass. I saw Director Sterling on the command balcony, screaming for his security detail to clear the rabble. He looked like a king watching his throne dissolve into sand. I didn't waste a bullet on him. The crowd got to him first. It was a poetic, visceral justice. The people he had labeled as waste tore him apart with their bare hands. I fought my way toward the motor pool, my SIG barking until the slide locked back on an empty mag. I transitioned to my backup, a subcompact Glock 43, firing into the heads of the hollows that tried to cut me off. The smell was unbearable. The metallic tang of blood, the sulfur of gunpowder, and the sweet, cloying rot of the dead. I found a tactical motorcycle, a rugged, blacked-out Kawasaki, and kicked it into life. The garage doors were jammed halfway open by a pile of bodies. I revved the engine, the roar echoing in the confined space, and laid the bike low, sliding underneath the gap. I emerged into a nightmare. The nest was a beacon of fire in the dark. The perimeter was gone. The swarm had arrived in earnest, a sea of gray flesh and white eyes that stretched as far as the moon could reach. I drove. I drove like a man possessed, weaving through the gaps in the horde, the tires splashing through puddles of gore. I headed west, away from the smoke, away from the ruins of the government I had served. My suit was shredded, my badge was gone, and I had just destroyed the last organized bastion of human authority in the tri-state area. I stopped an hour later, deep in the woods of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the air was cold and smelled of pine instead of death. I climbed off the bike and collapsed against a tree, the adrenaline finally leaving my system, replaced by a crushing, hollow ache. I looked at my hands. They were shaking now. I had saved the people at the gate, but I had also invited the devil to dinner. I was a traitor to the service and a savior to the damned, and I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph I'd taken from the White House, a picture of the staff at the annual Christmas party. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was whole. I struck a match and watched the edges curl and blacken. As the flame reached the faces of the people I'd failed, I realized that the Agent Miller, who had crossed the Potomac, was dead. This version of me, the one sitting in the dirt with a gun and a heart of ice, was something else entirely. I wasn't the storm anymore. I was the aftermath. I looked up at the stars, the same stars that had looked down on the Founding Fathers, the same stars that would look down on the ruins of the world long after the last of us was gone. The radio on my belt crackled. It wasn't the anvil signal. It wasn't a code. It was a woman's voice, clear and steady, broadcasting on a frequency I'd never heard. To anyone listening, she said, "We are at the coordinates 38.8 minus 78.2. We have food. We have walls. We have the cure. But we don't have enough hands to hold the line. If you can hear this, if you still remember what it means to be human, come find us." The coordinates were deep in the Shenandoah. It was a suicide mission. The roads would be choked, the woods would be crawling, and the cure was likely another lie from another man in a high tower. But as I looked at the dark silhouette of the mountains, I felt a familiar stubborn spark in my gut. It wasn't duty, it wasn't an oath. It was the simple primal urge to see what was over the next hill. I stood up, holstered my weapon, and kicked the bike back to life. The sky was beginning to turn a pale, sickly gray, the first light of a new day in a dead world. I didn't know if I would find a cure or another betrayal. I didn't know if I would survive the night. But as I throttled the engine and turned toward the mountains, I knew one thing for certain. The war for humanity wasn't just beginning. It was evolving, and I was the hunter that the evolution had never seen coming. I rode into the gray, a lone shadow against the rising sun, leaving the ghosts of DC to bury their own. The mission hadn't changed, not really. I was still in the business of protection. Only now, I wasn't protecting a president. I was protecting the last flicker of light in a world that had forgotten how to see. And God help anyone, living or dead, who tried to get in my way. The asphalt of the I-66 was a river of scorched steel and shattered dreams, a graveyard of suburban commuters who had never made it home to their manicured lawns. I threaded the bike through the gaps in the wreckage, my eyes scanning the tree line for movement that wasn't the wind. The further I got from the Capitol, the more the air changed. The heavy, metallic tang of the burning city faded, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of the Shenandoah, though even here, the rot lingered beneath the surface like a secret. My hands were cramped, frozen in the shape of the throttles, my knuckles white under my tactical gloves. Every mile was a victory. Every minute of silence was a reprieve. I thought about the men I'd left behind, the ones who had died in the West Wing, the ones who had turned, and the ones who had simply stopped fighting. I carried them with me, a ghost detail that didn't require a paycheck, their faces etched into the back of my eyelids. I was 3 days into the mountains when I first saw what the evolution looked like. It wasn't the clumsy, shambling mess of the DC streets. I was setting up a dry camp in a hollow between two ridges when I heard it, a rhythmic tapping, like wood on wood, echoing through the pines. It wasn't random. It was a signal. I didn't reach for my rifle immediately. I reached for my thermal binos. In the pale green glow of the lens, I saw them. They were taller, their limbs elongated by a hunger that had burned away the last vestiges of human posture. They didn't moan. They whispered. A low, wet sibilance that sounded like a prayer for the damned. They moved with a predatory grace, flanking the perimeter I hadn't even finished setting. They weren't just eating anymore. They were hunting. I stayed low, my heart hammering a slow, steady beat against my ribs. The rhythm of the range, the rhythm of a man who had been trained to stay calm when the world was screaming. I didn't fire. Fire was a dinner bell in these woods. Instead, I pulled the combat knife from my boot, the blade matte black and thirsty. I moved through the underbrush, using the shadows as my suit, the forest floor as my office. The first one came at me from the left, a blur of gray flesh and jagged teeth. I didn't panic. I stepped into its guard the way I'd been taught to intercept an assassin and drove the blade through the base of its skull. It went limp, but it didn't make a sound. No scream, no death rattle, just the heavy thud of meat hitting the pine needles. I realized then that the rules had changed. The Secret Service was about protecting a person from an idea, from a bullet, from a man with a grudge. Out here, the threat didn't have a manifesto. It just had a biological imperative to erase us. I spent the next 4 hours playing a deadly game of hide and seek in the dark, methodically dismantling a pack of 6 shades, as I began to call them. By the time the sun started to bleed over the eastern peaks, I was covered in a slick, black ichor that smelled like vinegar and old copper. I sat on a fallen log, cleaning my blade, and realized I wasn't shaking. I was sharp. The agent was gone. The hunter was fully formed. I pushed deeper into the Appalachians, following a rumor I'd heard on a scrambled frequency back in the city. A place called High Ground. It was supposed to be a communications hub, a reinforced bunker built during the Cold War that had been retrofitted for a catastrophe just like this. If there was a flicker of light left, it was there. But the road was a gauntlet. I passed through small towns where the silence was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. I saw the remains of last stands, barricaded diners, boarded up pharmacies, and the bleached bones of those who had stayed to defend them. Every time I felt the urge to stop, to rest, to let the exhaustion claim me, I'd see a child's toy in the road or a faded American flag fluttering from a porch, and the spark in my gut would flare into a roar. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a witness. I was the one who would carry the story of how the world ended, and, more importantly, how it refused to die. The terrain grew steeper, the bike struggling with the incline, until I finally had to cache it under a camouflage tarp and proceed on foot. My gear felt heavier now, each mag and water purification tablet a calculated weight. I was living on adrenaline and the leftover discipline of a decade of service. On the 5th day, I found the gate. It wasn't the high ground I had expected. It was a jagged scar of concrete and steel built into the side of a granite cliff. There were no flags, no guards in uniform, just a series of motion sensors and a heavy, reinforced door that looked like it could withstand a direct hit from a bunker buster. I didn't knock. I waited. I knew the protocols. I stood in the center of the clearing, hands away from my weapons, and waited for the optics to find me. It took 20 minutes. Then, the hiss of hydraulics. The door didn't open all the way, just enough for a woman in a tactical vest to step out, her rifle leveled at my center mass. She didn't look like a soldier. She looked like a ghost who had forgotten how to haunt. "Identify yourself," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. I didn't give her my name. Names didn't mean anything anymore. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old badge, the gold leaf tarnished, but still recognizable. I held it up, the sun catching the crest of the United States Secret Service. "I'm the man who ensures the continuity of government," I said, my voice sounding strange even to me. "But since there is no government left, I'm here to ensure the continuity of us." She stared at the badge for a long time, her finger hovering over the trigger. Then, slowly, she lowered the barrel. She didn't smile. She didn't welcome me home. She just stepped aside and motioned me into the dark. Inside, high ground was a labyrinth of humming servers, flickering fluorescent lights, and the smell of recycled air. There were maybe 50 people there. Scientists, engineers, a few ragged remnants of the National Guard, and families who had been lucky enough to be in the right place when the sky fell. They looked at me with a mix of awe and terror, as if I were a relic from a museum of a lost civilization. I was led to the center of the complex, a room filled with monitors displaying feeds from across the country, or what was left of it. Most were static. Some showed empty streets, but a few, just a handful, showed signs of life. Smoke from a campfire in the Rockies, a solar array in the Mojave, a flashing signal light from a tanker off the coast of Maine. "We've been trying to link them," a man said, his eyes rimmed with red. He was the lead technician, a guy who looked like he hadn't slept since the first bite was taken in D.C. "But the shifters, the ones you saw in the woods, they're cutting the lines. They're targeting the infrastructure. They're smarter than we realized. They're not just predators. They're a cleanup crew." I looked at the screens, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a cold, hard clarity. This was the mission. It wasn't about holding a bunker or waiting for a cure that might never come. It was about the network. It was about making sure these isolated pockets of humanity didn't flicker out in the dark. The evolution I had sensed wasn't just in the dead. It had to be in us too. We had to stop being the prey that hid and start being the force that reconnected the world. I spent the next month training the able-bodied survivors. I taught them threat assessment. I taught them how to move in a protective diamond. I taught them that a weapon is just a tool, and the real power is the mind that controls it. We weren't a secret service anymore. We were a public service. We began making sorties out into the surrounding valleys, clearing the shades and establishing a perimeter that actually meant something. We found more survivors. A doctor from Roanoke, a group of teenagers who had turned a hardware store into a fortress, a veteran who had been living in a treehouse. We brought them into the fold. But the world had one more test for me. The shades were gathering. They had sensed the activity at high ground, and like a hive reacting to a threat, they began to converge. On the night of the first heavy snow, the sensors started screaming. It wasn't a pack of 6 this time. It was hundreds. They came up the cliffs like spiders, their pale bodies nearly invisible against the white flurry. The siege of high ground was the most intense combat I had ever seen, worse than the breach at the White House, because this time I wasn't just protecting a person, I was protecting the future. I stood on the ramparts, my rifle barrel glowing hot, my ears ringing with the thunder of the defense. I saw the woman who had first met me at the gate fall, and I didn't have time to mourn. I just picked up her rifle and kept firing. We fought until the ammunition ran low, until our hands were numb, until the pile of dead outside the gate was so high they were using it as a ramp. In the darkest hour, when the inner door was buckling and the sounds of the shade's wet scratching were vibrating through the steel, I realized that I was the last line of defense. Again, I looked at the survivors huddled in the cafeteria. The children, the old men, the dreamers. I thought about the president's final look of realization in the Oval Office, and I knew I couldn't let this end the same way. I took the last of the C4 from the armory and stepped out into the cold. I didn't tell anyone. I just walked into the swarm. I was a Secret Service agent. I was trained to take the hit. I was trained to be the shield. I moved through the horde, a whirlwind of lead and steel, drawing them away from the gate, lure and lure, leading the bulk of the mass toward the old fuel storage tanks on the edge of the ridge. They followed me, their clicks of communication rising into a frenzied scream. They thought they had me. They thought I was a cornered animal. They didn't realize I was the bait. I reached the tanks, my body screaming in pain, my vision blurring. I had 3 bullets left. I didn't use them on the dead. I used them on the valves. As the fumes filled the air, I pulled the detonator from my belt. I looked back at the bunker, at the faint glow of the lights through the snow. They were safe. The network would hold. The flicker of light would grow. I felt a strange peace. I had done my job. My oath was fulfilled. I wasn't just an agent of the past. I was the architect of what came next. I pressed the button. The world turned to white. But I didn't die. Not that night. The blast threw me clear, over the edge of the ridge, and into a deep drift of snow that cushioned the impact. When I woke up, the sun was high and the world was silent. The horde was gone, vaporized or scattered by the explosion. The mountain was scarred, but the bunker was intact. I lay there for a long time, watching the clouds drift over the peaks. My suit was gone, replaced by rags. My badge was lost in the fire. My body was a map of scars and burns. But as I pulled myself up, shivering and broken, I saw something moving on the horizon. It wasn't a shade. It was a group of people from the bunker, coming down the trail with stretchers and hope. They were looking for me. I stood up, leaning against a charred pine for support. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had held the hands of world leaders, the hands that had taken lives, the hands that had built a sanctuary. I realized that the mission hadn't ended with the blast. It was just shifting again. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I wasn't just the protector. I was a part of the world that was being reborn. As they reached me, I didn't say anything about the Secret Service. I didn't talk about the White House. I just looked at the woman who had led the search party and reached out my hand. She took it, her grip warm and solid. "You're alive," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I have a lot of work to do," I replied, my voice a low rasp. We walked back toward the high ground together. The war for humanity was still evolving, and the shadows would always be there, waiting at the edge of the firelight. But as the sun hit the peak of the mountain, turning the snow into a field of diamonds, I knew that the dark didn't own the night anymore. We did. I had survived the White House. I had survived the fall of the world, and I had survived the evolution of the dead. But as I stepped back through those reinforced doors, I knew the greatest survival wasn't about staying alive. It was about remembering how to live. The mission was finally, truly complete. I was home. And for the first time in a world of ghosts, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I was looking forward.